So, last we left off in 2004, a group of engineers from Apple, Mozilla, and Opera came together to form a new organization, the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, or WHATWG. And this marked a striking shift in the industry because for years, browser makers were seen as the villains of the web story, pushing proprietary features, creating fragmentation, and undermining interoperability. But by this point, they were starting to look like the good guys. And in contrast to the academic, slower-moving W3C, these companies were now banding together to help fix the mess that they helped create. They wanted to evolve HTML based on how it was already being used, because they believed that real-world behavior should drive the specification, not idealized theories of how the web should work. Just a grounded view of how it did work. It's like that story that you hear about college campuses. I think it was Michigan State or Ohio State, where planners left the grass untouched on a new quad just to see where students would naturally walk. And after a while, footprints would get burned in, and only then the university would pave those routes instead of forcing students to follow pre-planned walkways. They let the usage dictate the design. So what WHATWG took was a similar approach, to watch what developers were doing, then formalize those practices into a spec. In other words, let the paths emerge first, and then lay the pavement, or in our case, publish the new standards. In the years after it was founded, WHATWG started gaining some traction, not just as a protest group, but as a serious force. And a major turning point came when Google joined the effort in the mid-2000s, because Google's involvement gave WHATWG the critical mass it needed. And here's where things got weird, because those same companies, Apple, Mozilla, Opera, and now Google, were still active participants in the W3C, because on paper they hadn't left, but in practice their energy and innovation were shifting from the W3C to WHATWG. And WHATWG became the place where real work was happening. For example, one of the biggest shifts WHATWG introduced was this thing called the living standard. Instead of publishing fixed versions like HTML4 or HTML5 and freezing them in time, the WHATWG spec would be continuously updated. No more version numbers, no more waiting years for the next official release. The spec was always in motion. So where did this versioning philosophy come from? The way I remember it, around that same time, the broader software industry was also moving away from big, infrequent versioned releases. Because with the rise of the internet-connected computers, real-time updates and continuous deployment, the idea of software as a constantly evolving service became the normal thing. You see, back in the old days, we would get our software updates shipped to us on physical media like floppy disks and CD-ROMs, but those were the dinosaur days. What WHATWG's living standard did is mirror the trend to deliver updates over the internet on an ongoing, ever-evolving basis. And that model stood in sharp contrast to the W3C's snapshot approach, where every few years they'd publish a finalized version, which was instantly out of sync as soon as it went out the door. Sometimes changes introduced by WHATWG were more about just making simplicity, just as much as having a new philosophy. Because one of the clearest examples had to do with the doc type. So instead of that ridiculously long error-prone line from the W3C, WHATWG's living standard just gave us a single elegant line. Open caret, bang, doc type space, HTML, and then close caret. That was it. And that alone cleared up years of confusion and made modern HTML documents that much easier to work with. So then it happened in 2019. After years of confusion and competing specs, the W3C and WHATWG finally reached a formal agreement that ended the fragmentation. The W3C signed a memorandum recognizing WHATWG's HTML and DOM specifications as the official standards going forward. And this marked the end of parallel development and conflicting documentation. So the W3C stepped back from HTML development and shifted to more of a support and liaison role, helping with outreach and testing and complementary technologies to the HTML and DOM. And it was kind of a big deal, quite a historic moment. After nearly 2 decades of fragmentation and competing specs, we finally had a single unified source of truth for how HTML and the DOM should behave. But that didn't mean that the W3C faded into irrelevance. It stayed responsible for a whole range of other important web technologies. For instance, there was ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is the standard that adds accessibility attributes for users who rely on assistive technologies. And the W3C also continued to lead the evolution of CSS, including modules like Flexbox, CSS Grid, and CSS variables. And then there's WCAG, or WHATWG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which shape how we design for users with disabilities. And there's SVG, which stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and that's the image format that gives us scalable, resolution-independent graphics for our web pages. And then there's also the semantic web with technologies like RDF. That's the Resource Description Framework. And OWL, or OWL, the Web Ontology Language. And SPARQL, pronounced Sparkle, and that's a query language for linked machine-readable data. And by the way, these are all the things that the W3C was so hung up on back in the XHTML days. So it looks like they finally got a chance to keep on working on their pet projects after all. So let's wrap this up, because I started the previous lecture by saying that the 1990s was a tumultuous time for the web. But as it turned out, the next couple of decades wasn't exactly smooth sailing either. But by the end of the 2010s, the web was just turning 30 years old and something important had shifted. It was like the web was finally growing up. Because today, browser makers follow the WHATWG's living standard for how the web actually works. And for us web developers, instead of wrestling with competing specs or guessing how a web browser might behave with the code that we write, we now have a single authoritative source of truth. And add to that modern web browsers auto-update themselves. We're no longer spending half our time testing for compatibility or working around quirks. We can finally focus on things like usability or performance or design, the things that actually matter to the people using the websites that we build. So, going forward in this course, this is where we change gears. By now, you should have a pretty good handle on the technology behind our web pages and understand the occasional weirdness with the way things work or don't work in a logical way. And that's important because now we turn the corner from development to design.